we've seen significant activity also from the Russians on the US in that area, which led to two comments by General Chip, who's the air component commander in CENTCOM, Central Command, where I used to work, that Russia are low on the professional ladder and have buffoonery in the area, and this is really what we're seeing from the Russians. What we can say is this is not something which will lead to Article 5, an act of war between NATO and Russia.
Russian pilot tried to shoot down an RAF surveillance plane after believing he had permission to fire. The pilot fired two missiles, the first of which missed rather than malfunctioned, as was claimed at the time. Russia had claimed the incident last September was caused by a technical malfunction. The UK's Ministry of Defence publicly accepted the Russian explanation. So what's going on? Let's speak to Major General Chip Chapman, former senior British military advisor and former head of counter-terrorism at the Ministry of Defence. Chip, good to talk to you again.
Good evening, Henry.
Hi, just wondering what you make of this, because the BBC and others have said that this clearly was not an accurate rendition of this incident. I mean, this was a guy who tried, even though it wasn't clear that he had permission to fire, and there was a bit of a kerfuffle with his co-pilot. What do you think the MOD was up to when it knew that this wasn't the truth?
Well, I don't think that's really the main issue. The real issue is that the RC-135 rivet joint, who was communications op in the area, was legitimately doing its business in international airspace. And here you've got a rogue Russian pilot doing something he shouldn't have done. Missile 1 failed to lock on the target. Missile 2 malfunction. Now, what we have seen since then, because this was September 22, is that on the 14th of March 23, we had the MQ-9 Reaper, an American very large drone, which crashed due to activity from the Russians. And more importantly, in the sort of Syrian area, we've seen significant activity also from the Russians on the US in that area, which led to two comments by General Chip, who's the air component commander in CENTCOM, Central Command, where I used to work, that Russia are low on the professional ladder and have buffoonery in the area, and this is really what we're seeing from the Russians. What we can say is this is not something which will lead to Article 5, an act of war between NATO and Russia.
So the front page of the Daily Star, which says, seconds away from World War III, Russian jet fired two missiles at RAF plane. That's overreaching a little.
It's absolutely overreaching, and you can say that from the fact that, for example, on the 24th of November 2015, a NATO ally partner, Turkey, and an F-16 shot down a Russian plane in Turkish airspace. The Russians didn't say that would lead to World War III. Actually, it led in NATO terms to Article 4. Patriot batteries were forward deployed. So you always have to be very careful about these maximalist positions from people. This is not going to happen. One of the things which you can say over the last 18 months is that it's been a good 18 months for deterrence. People have not overreacted in political terms. And at the end of the day, an act of war is a political phrase. It's not a legal term.
Right. So what would have happened after this incident? There clearly will have been a lot of back and forth between London and Moscow at a very high level. What would have changed as a result of this near miss?
Well, there's two things, really. The first thing is that in all these things, you should have a deconfliction protocol, which certainly there are in Syria. And secondly, the thing which has changed is that now the rivet joint with the communications platform is now escorted by RAF Typhoons, fighter jets, so that if there is anything like a hostile act, then that they can do something about that. And that's also an interesting phrase because, for example, when the Novichok incident occurred in the UK, Theresa May deemed that to be a hostile act. She didn't deem it to be an act of war, and that's why politicians are very, very reticent to, go to this Article 5 act of war. They might well term it a hostile act, which it might well be, but that's different than saying we should go all out for war, which we wouldn't do.
Yeah, got a text in here from Anne-Louise in Arundel, and she says regarding this news about the Russian fighter jet, she says, hate to even suggest this, but how long ago did Grant Shapps replace Ben Wallace as our defence secretary? Possibly no connection, just coincidence. I think Anne-Louise is talking about the release of this news. And then she says, I'm concerned about undertrained Ukrainian pilots dueling with equally undertrained Russian pilots in the phenomenally expensive fighter jets that we European taxpayers have supplied. Anticipate the diplomatic corps working serious overtime. That's from Anne-Louise. Your thoughts?
Well, everyone has rules of engagement, and what we've seen on this, because of the tete-a-tete between one of the two pilots, is that certain people have certain conditions different than the training. That doesn't mean, again, we will go to an act of war. You know, things can happen which are out of the norm, but that doesn't mean we'll go to an act of war on all of this sort of stuff. So Louise may be correct in her reticence on this and her fears of escalation, but one of the good things over the last 18 months is there really has been no escalation. And as I said, it's been a good year for deterrence. There's been no Russian strikes in NATO territory. There've been no Russian strikes anywhere on any parts of ours. They might say that they're at war with NATO, but they've actually been pretty reticent to do that because they know the consequences if NATO was mobilised against them.
All right. Major General Chip Chapman, former senior British military advisor, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio. Now,